hundreds of kilometers away from the sea, hidden among the mountains of Anatolia, an impregnable fortress. This was the Hittite Empire, home to the strongest land army of the Bronze Age, the masters of iron weapons. But how did a power known as the Sea Peoples wipe this colossal land empire? Completely off the map? This is more than a collapse. This is the story of an evaporation. And it is the most ruthless proof of how fragile that Golden Age system truly was. Welcome to the Shard of History. Let's recall the three superpowers of the late Bronze Age: Egypt, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites. Egypt was the brand. The Mycenaeans were the raider merchants. But the Hittites were the soldiers. They were the heavyweight champions of the system. Their military might was based on the superweapon of the age, the three-man heavy chariot. Unlike the two-man light chariots of the Egyptians, the Hittite chariot was a mobile platform, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a spearman. This made them a slow but unstoppable force on the battlefield. They proved this strength in one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Kadesh. Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II inscribed this battle on the walls of his temples as a giant victory, a true propaganda masterpiece. But we also have a treaty, and the Kadesh Treaty was not a text dictated by a victor, but one signed by two equal powers. This proves that while Ramesses lied, claiming "I won" in Egypt, the Hittites stopped him and forced him to sit at the negotiating table. The Hittites were the game makers. Their capital, Hattusa, was not just a city. It was a fortress city. Surrounded by high walls, far from the sea, it seemed impregnable. And they were brilliant not only militarily but also politically. They were the people of 1,000 gods. This didn't just mean they were religious. It meant they were politically astute. They didn't try to assimilate the people they conquered. Instead, they took their gods and brought them to their capital, adding them to their own pantheon. This was a brilliant way of telling the conquered people, "Your gods are now with us. You are now one of us." It was the spiritual glue holding the empire together. The Hittites seemed eternal. And then, around 1178 BCE, they disappeared. But let's not belittle that word. It wasn't a collapse. It was an evaporation. To understand this, think of Rome. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, what remained? The papacy. The Latin language remained as Europe's lingua franca. The legal system, architecture, and culture remained. Rome continued to live as a ghost. When the Mycenaeans collapsed, their palaces burned, but the people fled to the mountains. Their language, Greek, survived and returned after the Dark Ages. Egypt was battered by the Sea Peoples, weakened, but Egypt remained Egypt. But when the Hittites collapsed, nothing remained. Their capital, Hattusa, that impregnable fortress, was so severely burned that it was never again inhabited, not even for a single day. Their language, cuneiform script, and vast libraries of thousands of clay tablets were forgotten. So much so that, until archaeologists rediscovered them in the 19th century, whether the Hittites ever existed was considered a myth. They were mentioned in the Bible, but people thought it was just a legend. So, what happened? How did the army that stopped Egypt in Kadesh vanish before a handful of Sea Peoples pirates? How did this fortress so far from the sea get destroyed by threat coming from the sea? The answer lies in our Swiss watch metaphor. The answer is that the Hittites' power was also their most deadly weakness. The Hittites were a land empire, yes, but their economy was dependent on that globalized system, the sea. Remember the Hittite Empire's palace economy, the centralized system where everything was gathered in the palace. This system required a constant flow of grain to feed the massive cities and armies. But the highlands of Anatolia couldn't feed such a large population on their own. The climate was harsh, the soil barren. The Hittites were dependent on grain from Egypt and, more importantly, from the ports in Syria, like Ugarit. They even imported grain from the Black Sea, from what is now the Ukrainian steppes. Those ports were the gills of the empire. They were land creatures, but they needed the sea to breathe. What happened when the sea peoples arrived? First, they cut off those gills. We know from the last desperate clay tablet from the king of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. The king was shouting for help. "Enemy ships are here! They are burning my cities!" But who was he shouting to? The Hittite king. Where was the Hittite king? He had his own problems. Worse still, Ugarit's own navy had been sent by the Hittite king to defend the Aegean coasts. Ugarit was completely defenseless when the attack came. The Sea Peoples severed the Hittites' sea connections, and the Swiss watch stopped. When the grain ships didn't arrive, the palace economy in Hattusa collapsed. It wasn't just the grain, it was bronze. The weapons of that army, that global trade network, were tied to it. When tin from Afghanistan stopped coming, the army couldn't produce new weapons. The system froze. The interpretation here is this. Before the Sea Peoples burned Hattusa, Hattusa was already starving to death. One of the last records we have is a letter from the last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, begging the pharaoh of Egypt to send emergency grain ships to save my life. The pharaoh, the orderly king of Egypt, showed mercy and sent grain to the Hittites. But this was like giving aspirin to a dying empire. The burnt grain found in the final layers of Hattusa's destruction. This is the archaeological evidence of famine. The system had collapsed. And this brings us back to the darkest theory: civil war. What did the starving people do when the palace economy left them behind? What did they do when the people of 1,000 gods were no longer feeding them? There was always a troublesome tribe to the north of the Hittite Empire, the Kashka. When the Hittites were strong, they controlled the Kashka with money or their army. But when the money and grain ran out, what would those mercenaries do? They would turn on their masters. Were those who burned Hattusa merely the sea peoples from outside? Or did they have help from within? The people of the Hittite Empire, who no longer believed in the king, and the Kashka warriors who joined them. This wasn't an invasion. It was a revolution. The last inscription of the last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, makes this tragedy even more ironic. In the inscription, he proudly talks about a small naval victory against the Sea Peoples off the coast of Cyprus. It's a portrait of a man boasting about pulling a weed from his garden while his house burns down. The king didn't even realize his empire was collapsing from the inside, that the system had frozen. He was fighting a small symptom far from home. The Sea Peoples were a sledgehammer, we said. But when it came to the Hittites, that sledgehammer was already striking a wall that was cracking from the inside, weakened by hunger, and had lost its central authority. That's why the blow was so deadly, why the empire was wiped out so completely. Others were shaken. The Hittites were shattered. What remains of them is ashes and forgotten gods' names. The storm of the Sea Peoples had taken its first and greatest victim. But that storm wasn't over. It had set its sights on the golden-masked Mycenaean kings, the pirate lords of the Aegean. Subscribe to the Shard of History. In our next episode, we go to the land of legends, Greece. Why did the Mycenaean palaces burn? And how did this collapse trigger one of the darkest dark ages in history?